Hello everyone, this is Etsy Shadow and in this video I'll be talking about basics of Linux Privilege Escalation. So let's get started. Linux Privilege Escalation is the process of elevating privileges from a low privilege user to a higher one in a Linux or Unix system. So whenever you get a shell on a vulnerable target that is running Linux or Unix, in most of the time that shell comes with a lower privilege user. You don't get root directly. In some cases you get root, but it's not always the case. So that thing restricts your access to the system. You have some restrictions and you do not have a complete access to the system. So in order to get complete access and remove any restrictions, you need to perform Linux privilege escalation. So here I have collected some common vectors that are used for Linux privilege escalation, and I will explain all of them one by one. First one is sudo rights abuse. For example, your current user, which is a low privilege user, has some rights to run sudo command with some other program or binary as root or some higher privilege user. Then you can simply abuse those sudo rights to get a higher user. To check that, you need to input sudo -l command in the terminal. Second one is SUID permission abuse. So SUID is a special kind of permissions that allows a normal user to run a file with the permissions of the user who owns the file. With this way we can also abuse the rights and the SUID permission, and we may put our malicious code in that SUID file and exploit it to get a higher privilege. Third one is the famous one but the tricky one. We call it kernel exploits. So many security researchers daily research on Linux and finds out various vulnerabilities in which some of them are found in kernel of the system. So with using those kernel exploits, one writes a script and then compile it and then run it on the target intended system, and with that kernel exploit we can directly get into root. This is my least favorite, however this is the easiest method, but as I am already telling you, it has some trick in it. Using kernel exploits are easy part, but finding kernel exploits is one bit of a tricky part. To find a kernel exploit, you need to have a good hands-on experience with the Linux and Unix environment, and then it would be easy for you. I will make a dedicated video about how you can find the correct kernel exploits as well in future. So with kernel exploits, all you need to do is find out the current version of the Linux, current distribution version of the Linux. For example, it could be running some version of Ubuntu along with some version of Linux, and then you can use tools like searchsploit or exploitdb or directly Google to find out kernel exploits. After that, if that kernel exploit comes in C file, then you have to compile it, and after compiling it you can transfer it to the target system and run it to get root access. Next one is cron jobs abuse. So cron jobs are basically scheduled tasks which we run automatically in periodical manner. So there are many tasks that are required to be run by Linux system periodically in order to maintain the system. But however, if a user has scheduled his own personal task with some binary, then that cron job can be abused using various techniques to get a higher privilege user. Next one is process or service running as high privilege user. So Linux system always runs some kind of processes and services as various user, and you can check that by inputting ps-aux command, and you will see a list of process running as various users and root as well. So if there is a service, for example MySQL running as root, then you can simply log into that process, and with some kind of special method you can get root privileges and move to a higher privilege user. Next one is hard coded passwords. So there are many enumeration techniques, commands, and there are also many automated tools that can be used to find out hard coded password stored in many configurations file. And with those passwords you can perform brute force attacks against various users to see if those password works or not, and this may also lead to at least a lateral movement or a full privilege escalation. Next one is NFS no root squash. So NFS is a file system which allows us remote mounting of file system. So if your vulnerable target is having NFS turned on and it has no root squash, then what you can do is you can simply mount the share which is available for NFS mounting, and then create your own malicious file with root privileges and then run it on a vulnerable machine. Since the system is having no root squash, so your root permissions from the file will not be removed, and hence you can get to the higher privilege user. Next one is brute forcing SSH. So if the target system is running SSH and you have read access to etc password file, then you can simply take out the usernames from etc password file and use a tool called Hydra to brute force the SSH with a word list like RockU. So if there are any weak passwords are getting used, then you will get to know about that, and you can simply use those passwords to elevate to other users. Next one is sensitive file read write permission. So there are many files in Linux system. Some of them are made by system and some of them are user created. I'll be talking about the system created files. So there is a file called shadow file. It is stored in the etc folder, so we call it etc shadow file. So etc shadow file contains all the hashes of all the users, all the password hashes which are being used as passwords. So even if you have read permission of that etc shadow file, then you can simply take out all the hashes and use tools like John the Ripper and Hashcat to simply decrypt those hashes and get access to other users. And in other case there is a file called etc password, and if you have write permission to etc password, then you can simply get into the etc password file. You can edit that and add your own custom user with root privileges. This will also lead to a privilege escalation. Next one is custom exploitation. So custom exploitation comes under a different category. So there might be some extra steps involved in custom exploitation. For example, if there is a SUID binary that can be exploited, however it is differently configured in a particular system, then the generic method is not going to work. In that case, you need to use your own mind and figure out how you can perform the privilege escalation. So you can call this the most difficult type of privilege escalation, because you have to figure out what's wrong here. Once I was performing a type of privilege escalation which was using databases, and in my case the database was MariaDB, and in default there was different kind of server running. So with that I was stuck for almost 2 hours, and then I figured out that how you can use the custom way to use the public exploit, and then I modified the exploit and used it and successfully escalated to root user. 11th one is a kind of odd vector of privilege escalation, because it's not common. It does not comes in most of the cases. It is very rare. but still we have to know about it, because in some rare cases this might come as well. So capabilities are also a type of units that are made for super user privileges. Super user privileges are divided into different parts, and capabilities are part of that. And if you have capabilities with some pseudo rights, means with higher privileges rights, then you can simply abuse those rights, and you can abuse capabilities to move into a higher privilege user. So this was all about common vectors. If you have any more common vectors in your mind, then you can simply tell me in comment section. That would be great for me as well. Next, coming up upon automated scripts. So there are many automated scripts that are not made for Linux privilege escalation, but made for finding out the vectors for Linux privilege escalation. These scripts are not going to automatically give you higher rights, although linpeas has some limited functionality of that, but overall all these tools are not going to help you to get privilege escalation straightforward. However, if you are experienced and you have some knowledge, then you can view the results of these tools and save some time on your Linux privilege escalation. So there are 4 tools in my list. First one is linpeas, second one is linenum, third one is linpriv checker, fourth one is Linux exploit suggester. In my practical portion of this series, I'll be making practical videos on how to use this tool. For now, you can just Google all these tools and try doing experiments with these tools on your own. Although linpeas is my favorite. Next, talking about post enumeration techniques. So this is something that no one talks about, and we really need to know about this thing. So suppose you have found the privilege escalation vector. There is some kind of privilege escalation vector. Let's take an example that you have found a cron job running in every 2 minutes with pseudo privileges with the root user. But what's next? How you can abuse that cron job? There has to be some methodology that has to be implemented in order to get into higher privileges. So for that, I have created few steps which you can perform, and they may help you. Not in all the case, but they may help you to get the correct technique. First thing you can do is check for write permission on the file. So if your cron job or any other file which is related to privilege escalation vector, you can go to that file and you can check the permissions, and if you can write to that file, then you may add your own malicious code to the file, and when the sudo or when the cron job will be executed in 2 minutes, your malicious code will be executed. However, if you do not have any write permission, then second point might help you. So let me read it out to you. If file is readable, then try to understand the file and exploit its dependencies. So let me give you a very clear example here. I'm talking about Python library hijacking. This is just an example. There could be different segments of file available. There could be different dependencies. Not Python in all the cases, but I'm just giving you the example. So talking about Python library hijacking, suppose you have a file running in cron job and the name of the file is hello.py, and that file is having some of the Python libraries being used. So if you do not have write access to that file, then you cannot abuse that and you cannot add your own content. So what you can do is, if you have read access to that file, then you can check about what libraries are being used, what commands are being executed, and then you can check all those libraries permissions. For example, if some test name library is being used, then you can go to the test library and see if you can edit the content of that test library. And if you can edit the content of test library, then you can simply add your own malicious code there, and after 2 minutes when the main file will be executed, so since it is having the test library in the file, so that will also be executed along with the main file. There might be cases where you need to dig deeper. For example, in test.py library there might not be a writable permission, but that test.py might be using some kind of library that is having writable permission. So you can go to that library as well. You can dig deep as far as you want. It's all up to you, where you can, as soon as you get the right access, you can simply abuse that. So third thing is that if you do not have even read or write permission, then what can be done is check if file is at relative path or fixed path, then try path variable abuse. So suppose that cron job is running a file called test.py and it is not specifying the full path of the file. For example, if the file is in home user test.py, the cron job might be mentioning that it's just the test.py file that is being run in every 2 minutes. So what you can do is you can simply add your own path. That could be the tmp path because it is always writable. You can add the temp path to the top list of the top variable, path variable. If you add your own path in the top of the path variable, then whenever system will try to find the absolute or exact path, it will first search the file in your first path. That could be temp. So what you can do is you can create your own test.py file in your temp path, and when cron job will start to run, it will first look at your directory for the file, and if it finds the file in your directory, then it will simply give priority to your file instead of the file stored in home user, because your file is having high priority in the path variable. It comes before every path. So this is how you can use path variable, and after 2 minutes your test.py will run and your malicious code will be executed instead of the correct file. Now last but not the least, what you can do is you can check for any public exploit for certain files. So there are many files of various softwares and programs running in Linux system, and the exploitation process could be tricky. The custom exploitation thing might get too much tricky for you. So there might be some good security researchers who might have done a good research on that topic or that software or that file, and there might be some public exploit already available for it. So if that is the case, then you can simply Google the name of the file and type it with a local privilege escalation keyword, and then you might find a public exploit or set of instruction to exploit that, and then you can simply follow those instructions to get into higher privileges. So these are the 4 common points. However, there could be more possibilities which are not written here, so you also have to use your own mind for that. Everything is not constant and fixed. New things are coming every day, so you have to be flexible with that. Now coming to the last topic, that is lateral movement. So lateral movement is getting access to different user having high, equal or low privileges compared with current user. So just suppose that there are 3 users, root, user 1 and user 2 in a Linux system, and you have found a way to get into the shell of user 2 while you are currently in a user 1 shell. So this would be called a lateral movement. If you are moving from user 1 to user 2, then it would be called a lateral movement because you are performing movement to a different user. Now as I have mentioned that user can have high, equal or low privileges. So how we can make a use out of it? So this may contain information required for privilege escalation. For example, if the user that we just moved laterally is having equal or low level of privileges compared to our current user, that is user 1, then we will try to look for sensitive information in various files and see if there are any kind of information or any passwords or something like that that may lead to privilege escalation, and that would be equally helpful. However, it would not be called direct privilege escalation, it would be called privilege escalation through lateral movement. Now third point is lateral movement is not same as privilege escalation until the next user is having some extra privileges than current user. So for example, user 2 was just having some information that can be used to escalate to highest privilege user, that is root. So this would not be called a privilege escalation, this would be simply called a lateral movement. However, if the user 2 is having some kind of extra privileges, for example user 2 might be having permission to run some certain binary as root with using sudo rights, and then with that he can use that to abuse the rights and move to highest privilege user. In that case it would be called a privilege escalation. So this is basically my theory. For different people theories could be different, but this is what I think about lateral movement. So for this video this is pretty much it. I hope you enjoyed the video and gained some good amount of knowledge with it. Thanks for watching.